Hey, welcome to Fathering Our Future, the podcast for dads. I'm Anthony Vandegrift, and I am not the perfect dad, but every day I am trying to be better. I've been talking about adoption a lot recently, and I have a stellar interview to share with you today. I am joined by the president and CEO of the National Council for Adoption. His name is Ryan Hanlon, and he's going to share incredible insight and information about adoption. And he's also going to help us understand that adoption might not be as expensive as we think it is. Here you go. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being with me. I'm really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yeah, it's an absolute joy to have you. And, as you know, adoption has been a big discussion point in the media and amongst friends, at least in the U.S. And I have some questions about adoption. I know that there are some ideas about adoption that exist out there, some that I've held most of my life, really for no reason. And I thought, who better to address this and talk about it than the president and CEO of the National Council for Adoption? So I think you're going to be a great voice of authority on this, and I'm really grateful to have you.
We're honored to be able to share the message of adoption, to give accurate information about adoption to the public, and so that's our mission, is to help people have better information, to be informed, and to for those that are pursuing adoption to have clear and accurate expectations of, what adoption is, what that means.
That's awesome. Well, we're right in line today. This is going to be great. But out of the gate, let's start with this. So I know a little bit about you. I read your bio on the website. Very smart, very well-educated guy. You told me that you're a dad of 4. That's right. That's quite the accomplishment. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little something extra, something fun.
Sure. So, as you said, 4 kids, and they keep us very busy. So I wish I had tons of free time, but in my free time, my favorite thing to do is read. I love to go to the lake cabin that my family has. That's like my favorite spot to be at. Really, any season. In the middle of the winter, it's nice to go and build a fire and just sit there and read. And in the summer, it's nice to get out in the water with the family, watch the kids goof around.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to this. I know you're going to be a great insight. I mean, like as you stated, it is your mission, and that's what you do all the time. So let me start with this. So I think that this, from at least my context and circle of friends and peers and those that I'm in relationship with, there's always been this idea that adoption is expensive. If you're going to adopt a kid, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, and it's going to wreck you financially. So there's been a big pushback of, well, we're not in the place to adopt because we don't have enough money to adopt. But let me just ask you right out of the gate, is that true? Is adoption really that expensive?
So that is a complex answer because there's different types of adoption. And so I think what might be helpful as we're talking through this for your listeners is to talk through the different types of adoption and how expensive they are, because I think that the answer is yes, it's expensive, and the answer is no, it's not expensive at all, depending on the type of adoption that we're talking about. But before we even address that, let me respond to what I heard you say as you were describing this, which is there's the perception that it's expensive. And we recently did a survey of adoptive households. It's actually the largest survey of adoptive households that's ever been done. And that was one of the questions we asked them. Before your adoption, did you perceive the cost as a barrier? And the majority said they did. And we asked, after your adoption, did you perceive the cost as a barrier? And many of them still said so, but it really made a difference the type of adoption they were pursuing. So, to jump into it, the 3 main types of adoption in the United States are private domestic adoption, what we often would think of as like infant adoption. Another type would be international, or what's in the field often referred to as inter-country adoption. And then the third one would be adoption from foster care. And, between those 3, adoptions from foster care are far more common than the other two. They're far more common than the other two combined. And so the majority of adoptions that happen in the U.S. are adoptions from the U.S. foster care system, and the cost to adopt from foster care is either free or very, very minimal for almost every adoption.
Wow.
And so when we look at the big picture of adoptions in the U.S., the majority of adoptions have very little cost associated with them. However, when we're looking at all three of those types of adoptions, the cost for a private domestic adoption or an intercountry adoption can give people a little bit of a sticker shock. That same survey I mentioned, it's a free, publicly accessible through our websites and other places, called Profiles in Adoption. We break down the average costs for private domestic adoption in the last decade. The average cost for a private domestic adoption was around $33,000.
Okay.
The cost for an international, or what we would call an intercountry adoption, was around $37,000. And so, that will cause some people to say, "Gosh, adoption is expensive." To your question, and I don't know if I can move forward. I don't know if I can make that happen. And I'd say, cost is something to think about. And so I wouldn't want to tell people, "Oh, don't worry about it." But it's important to also know what additional resources are available. For one, there's a very generous tax credit that many families that are pursuing those types of adoption can qualify for. The adoption tax credit is something you would receive after your adoption. It's a federal tax credit. It's tied to your income, your tax liability. If you have very low income or no tax liability, then you might not be eligible for that. And for higher income households, much higher income households are going to be phased out of receiving that as well. But the majority of middle income families are going to be benefiting from that federal tax credit, and it's very generous. It changes every year. Currently, it's over $14,000 that families would receive as a credit after their adoption. So when you're looking at a $33,000 or $37,000 adoption process, that's a big chunk of it. Right there, that is designed to reimburse for the expenses that are incurred. But that's not the only resource. There's a number of grant-making organizations whose purpose is to fund families so that cost is not a barrier to adoption. So they'll fund families, at often a few $1,000s, for families that are receiving these grants. And so they're able to, continue to move forward with their process that way. And there are a lot of organizations that do that type of work. Many employers have benefits as well. And so when families are thinking through that, it's important to think through the game plan and your cash flow, because you will incur those expenses over a year or two throughout your adoption process. But to also be thinking through, where might I be getting additional resources? I've seen more and more churches have funds and opportunities to set up support, including financial support. And so, those families that really put their mind to it often are very creative. They find ways to fundraise and have yard sales and other ways where they are able to not allow cost to be the barrier for them to be able to pursue those adoptions. I'll repeat what I said though. The majority of adoptions in the U.S. are from foster care, and they have very minimal, if any, costs associated with them.
Wow. So I've always understood adoption, just personally. I've always understood it as you're basically getting a newborn. You're basically getting an infant. So I guess I've only ever known adoption other than international as the private option, the private domestic option that you've spoken of, which is, like you said, if it's around $33,000, most people will probably say, well, that's a considerable chunk of money to have to pay. And now with adoption, is that money that is paid all at once, or is it phased? How does it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not paid all at once. It's going to be paid in part to an adoption agency. It could be associated with travel, because even for something like a private domestic adoption, you might travel to another state. Could be for legal fees, that sort of thing. And so it's not something that's paid all at once. It would be paid over a period of time throughout your process.
I got you. So even though it's substantial, it could still be something that's managed and cash flowed and not actually be that big of a hit. Okay. Well, that's good
exactly
to know too.
Right. And to your, what you were saying earlier, that is primarily infants. It's not always infants, but primarily infants for private domestic. Inter-country, those kids are usually a couple of years old or older. And
sure.
Then for foster care, there's a very, very wide range of ages and sibling groups that are placed, together as well. And so, for families that are thinking through what does adoption look like for them, there's really a very wide range of ages that we'd be thinking through in terms of what that looks like. It would be a rarer thing for an inter-country adoption or foster care adoption to be placing, a newborn or somebody whose age we're measuring in months instead of years.
Right. Okay. So why is it, in your opinion, why do you think there's this preconceived idea that adoption is expensive? Now, again, I approach this from a Christian background. I've always heard in church circles that it's expensive, and it might not be that way in every societal circle. Everyone might not have the understanding that I have, but I mean, this was something that was passed down from parents and even beyond that. Why do you think that idea formed? Because obviously there's a clear range, like you mentioned, and why is it stuck around?
I think a lot of times when people are talking about adoption, they might have in mind just one type of adoption. So, like, for example, what I heard from you is what comes to mind for you is private domestic adoption, the infant adoption. And so, if our mindset's formed around just one type of adoption, we might have less understanding of some of those other types, or that might just not be what comes to mind for us. And so I think I think what we can do, and I think this show is helping others learn more. We're spreading the word that there are, free or nearly free opportunities where families can be involved and can pursue adoption. And for those that aren't pursuing adoption from foster care, there are a lot of resources available so that they don't have to allow that to be a barrier for them, that they can still move forward. And, I've known many families. Prior to working here, I worked for an adoption agency. It was very common for families to be getting these grants that I mentioned earlier. There's a number of very generous grant-making organizations. And so for families that are determined, there's going to be options. They're going to be able to find a way to afford adoption.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I recently did an interview with somebody who he and his wife were foster parents. They fostered approximately 15 kids. They adopted one ultimately or one or two. They adopted two through the fostering system. I guess I didn't realize that was an option. And again, I'm coming up as I don't think it's really something that's taught. So you kind of grow up as a kid, not really knowing anything about it. You just, you have the one person that you go to school with who is adopted, and that's the extent of your knowledge about adoption. And you never really learn about it unless you try to go out and actually research it. Is this idea that adoption is so expensive being fixated on only, private domestic adoption? Is there not a lot of promotion and advertising that goes into fostering to adopt or adopting from the foster care system? Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I think that's a process that's run at the state level, so every state is different in that regard.
Okay.
But one of the complexities to think through is that when children enter the foster care system, the primary goal is to pursue reunification with the birth family for these children, almost always.
Okay.
And so, what you mentioned an example of a friend of yours who was a foster parent, fostered a number of children, adopted one of them. That's actually not uncommon. And we know that the number one adopters from foster care are foster parents. Many of the times they're relatives of the child. More often they're not, and they are serving as the foster parent when reunification is no longer the goal for that child. The next plan, for finding permanency for that child is going to be to pursue an alternative option. Usually that option looks like adoption by a relative, by a non-relative. Very often it ends up being the foster parent of that child. And so if families are really interested in adoption from foster care, that might look like serving as a foster parent prior to that. Not always. And there are children who are already within our child welfare system who've had their parental rights terminated. But the most common route for someone who's ending up as an adoptive parent through foster care is to have first served as a foster parent.
I see. Okay, I can understand why that would make things a little trickier. Like you mentioned, the primary goal of children in foster care is not to get them adopted. It's more so to reunite them with family.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that is the primary outcome for children who go to foster care, is that they are reunified with their families. But adoption is also a common outcome for many children. Yeah. And last year there were 58,000 children who were placed for adoption from the U.S. foster care system. And I imagine this year we're gonna see something similar. And so foster families are they're tasked with a really difficult job of supporting and helping pursue, in partnership with the state, reunification. They're also raising a child and treating that child as a member of their family. There's a lot to that, and if families are in a situation where they think, this isn't the right time or place for me to be a foster parent, then it might be worth considering either a different type of adoption, or if it's the right thing for their family, an adoption of a child who's already had parental rights terminated.
I got you. And if for a child who has had their parental rights terminated, is that something where a family could contact the agency and specifically say, we're not interested in fostering, but we are interested in adoption? Can you pinpoint these children who no longer have parental rights?
Yeah, that does look different from one county or state to the next, but in general, yes, that is going to be an option for families. The federal government also helps fund the promotion of adoption for those children. So families can get information from adoptuskids.org, and that's going to have information about adoption for families that have gone through what's called the home study process, where they've been reviewed. They can actually be considered for matches with children who are waiting on adoption.
Okay. Wow, it's really cool. And that was
adoptuskids.org. Yeah.
adoptuskids.org. Okay, that's a very cool resource. Thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
Okay, so let's dive into this. So we've talked a little bit about this common understanding, this myth, I guess we could call it now, that adoption's really expensive, because it sounds like it really isn't always expensive. And even if you do choose to go private domestic, it's almost as if there are scholarship and grant programs for someone trying to go to college. Like they're going to help you and accommodate you trying to go through with adoption if that's the route you choose.
That's right.
So
yeah, and especially
understanding that
if they're able to, if they're eligible for that tax credit, that's a huge chunk of the expenses that were incurred coming back to that family either the year after when they file their taxes after they finalize.
Right, which is fantastic. Okay, so now that we've determined that adoption really is more affordable than most people probably think, before we go down the proper path of how to start the process for adoption, speak to what families need to determine in regards to whether or not adoption is right for them, about the physical presence of their family, the mental, the emotional side of things. Mm-hmm. How can a family know if adoption's right for them, if it's something that they should pursue?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there's a few things they can do up front. They want to be getting more and more information about what is adoption and what should I expect. I mentioned that research report earlier. That would be a great place to start. It would be to read through that, learn about the experiences of adoptive families, what post-adoption experiences look like, what the length of the process is, what the expenses are, what families say about their motivations, what they say about their satisfaction, and really be informing themselves, not just from that report, but from lots of different areas, and to learn about different types of adoption. Before you can decide, should I adopt, you would also want to be saying, what type of an adoption should I be pursuing? And that's going to be a foundational question before we even determine like what agency should I be working with, because different adoption agencies are going to have different types of programs for families. One agency might only do international adoption or only do private domestic. If we're going to pursue foster care, we should likely look at our local county or state before we're looking at alternative options. And so we want to be thinking through that. I think part of the question that you're getting at, though, is if there's a couple that's talking through, should we consider adoption, they'll want to be considering a number of different areas of their life. Are we at a place where we can devote the time it's going to take and the energy and the emotion to go through what's can be a grueling process of paperwork and meetings and trainings, and it's also very emotional as you're waiting on this for families that are pursuing adoption from foster care. Again, thinking through is being a foster parent the good first step before pursuing adoption, and they'll want to be thinking about other aspects of their life. Are there other means in which they're also hoping to grow their family, and how does that work in terms of timing? If there's a couple that's pursuing adoption and then they experience a pregnancy, what does that mean for them? Are they putting the adoption on hold? Many adoption agencies are going to have policies and say your adoption's on hold until a certain period when your child's 1 or whatever the agency's policy is. And so families need to be thinking through some of the implications there, and also thinking through, okay, then what's the age of the child going to be when he or she joins my family? If I'm pursuing an adoption from foster care or international adoption, and this is an older child, how's that going to work out for our family? For if there's other children in our family, what are the implications of all that? And that's not the type of question you want to be asking, midway through your process. You want to have a sense of that, so you can say, yeah, we're going to plan this. For example, we'll plan this that we're going to ensure that this child's going to be younger than the other children in our home. And what does that mean? Well, we're pursuing the adoption of a 2-year-old. Let's make sure our youngest is at least 2 by the time we start this process. We're expecting the process to take a year or 2, that sort of thing.
So you just ended on this point, I'll ask because I'm curious your take on it. I know my wife has talked about if we do choose to adopt, wanting to adopt a child that would fall in the age of in the proper rank, I guess. If they would technically be child number 4 for us, so they would be the youngest,
Right.
truly. Is there any recommendation on if that should always be the case? If there's some do's and don'ts with that?
A lot of social workers think that your wife is right on there. They would say that breaking birth order can be difficult for everyone, but especially the children that are already in the home, and that it can be a really beneficial thing to maintain the birth order that's happening. So, that there are times where I've seen families, not follow that and be successful. In general, I think that's the way most social workers would lean. And certainly, my wife, it was the same thing. That was what was, one of the things that was very important to her. Our fourth did join our family through adoption. And so, as you were suggesting, your wife has thought through it. That's how we, planned it. Was like, okay, we're going to make sure the youngest is, a certain age before our adoption's complete.
My wife's going to be really happy to say that you were probably that she was right. So she's going to enjoy listening to this podcast.
She didn't pay me either.
All right. Yeah, I know. It's remarkable. She's going to love that. My second question is really similar to the first question that I asked. And, how does a family kind of process whether or not this is something that they should consider doing? Once they make that decision, which I know you alluded to the fact that they should do their research, they should do their homework, and they should make sure that they're in a place to be able to manage a child, devote the time, have the emotional stability, maybe even have some of the finances in order to, support a child. But what are some things after they've made that decision that they need to do? You might be able to speak to this personally. So, you already had 3 kids of your own, but in bringing a 4th into adoption, what are some of the things that you're working on prior to the adoption being finalized?
Yeah, great question. And let me say one more thing about even thinking through and preparing and making that decision is talking to other adoptive families. Talk to families that have completed an adoption that you're considering, and really allowing that to help inform our understanding and setting our expectations for what that means. And not just one family, not just the one family down the block or the family at church, but talk to a handful of families. You can get referrals from adoption agencies that you're talking to, but find them in different avenues on your own, and hear what lessons they've learned along the way, and that will also be part of my answer to the question you just asked, which is once you know what you're pursuing this, what are you doing to prepare? And I think a big part of that is being within a community that is going to be supportive to you, and oftentimes that's going to look like other adoptive families or foster families who have the experience that you can share, and that will have families that are somewhat like your family will be, and that's going to help prepare, and it's going to help once the adoption is finalized for you to have an immediate support and community that you can be turning to and talking through if there are challenges that arise in some manner. And this, you're a father, there's going to be challenges that arise with every kid, however that kid has joined our family. And, having others in our lives that can be supportive of us is going to be, absolutely critical. When families are in process, they're going to be required to receive training, and that's going to be dependent on, the state where they live, the agency they're using. So it's not going to look, the same for everyone. But what I'll say is families should take that seriously, and, and not just hit the minimum, but continue to educate themselves. There's a plethora of books and articles and online webinars and community, forums, in-person training opportunities that families can continue throughout their process, and even after the adoption is finalized, where they can continue to learn. And Anthony, most of this ends up being good parenting advice. This is something that we can apply not just to our child who joined the family through adoption. This can be applied for our parenting in general. Most of us weren't given a manual. Here's how to parent your child. Here's how to be a dad. Here's how to be a mom.
Exactly. And if you were given a manual, it was flawed.
Yeah, exactly. And so, our continuing to educate ourselves, to learn from others, and to be in a community with other parents that are serious about figuring this out is going to benefit us. And not just, going through the motions, checking the box, but really, really taking that seriously.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's good advice. You mentioned, research has been a really heavy part of what families need to do when they're looking to adopt. Now, you mentioned that you have a pretty extensive survey that's on your website. I browsed and looked at it all, but are there testimonials on your site as well?
There are a lot of examples from families. We often like to include adoptive parents, adopted individuals, birth parents in the articles that we write, and to capture what their actual experiences are that give a lot of color to the data that we have. And so we do often use that. We do often look to hear their stories and to know what their experiences were. So, as families are going through our website, reading through those articles, again, they're free resources. You'll see that we're continuing to hear their voices, hear their experiences. We often have we have a lot of resources also for adoption agency professionals and for social workers to inform them, and we want to hear their voice as well, because when we hear from a social worker that's worked with hundreds of families, gosh, she has so much that she can share with us that we really want to try and capture that. And who's the best audience? Well, I think it can be other professionals. It can also be prospective adoptive parents. It could be families that have already been formed through adoption. They're all going to be benefiting from the wisdom that has been gathered from years and years of experience.
Right. Now, I'm going to be sure to add your website into the description for this podcast and everywhere else that I post it. But go ahead and share it. I think you shared it at the beginning. Go ahead and share it one more time with everybody so they can
It's
go to your website and check out these resources.
adoptioncouncil.org. That's adoption, and then council is COUNCIL. So adoptioncouncil.org. And then to access that research article I mentioned, it's adoptioncouncil.org/profiles. Okay.
Very, very good. Very nice. I'm sure that I myself will be visiting a lot of that. So, thank you for having all that available. It sounds like what families really need. I mean, again, you're the president and the CEO of the National Council for Adoption. You ought to know a thing or two when it comes to adoption, and for you to share what you've shared and put such a big emphasis on, make sure you're knowledgeable, make sure that you've done your homework and you've researched all of this as you're going through the process and after the process has already finalized and you are an adoptive parent. So I think it's very good that you've put so much information and so many resources out there for families. So check out the website, all of those listening, all of those watching. Even if you don't want to adopt, just check it out, and maybe you'll want to adopt after you read everything.
And it can be helpful to give information to others. And there are a lot of misconceptions about adoption, and so to your point, adoption. Even if they don't want to adopt, they can be better informed about adoption, and maybe as it's coming up or they're talking to others, they can help share more information. There was a different study I read recently where they were studying what Americans' perceptions of adoption are, and what they understood for private domestic adoption. And women who experience an unplanned pregnancy often don't know they can choose who the birth parents are. They can choose the level of an open adoption relationship that they want. They're empowered to that. They can have their own legal counsel for free through the decision-making process as they're learning more about adoption and considering making an adoptive placement. And but unfortunately, women often don't know that. They don't know that they have those opportunities, because that's not the way adoption looked 30 years ago. It's not the way adoption often looked 20 years ago. But it is how adoption looks now. The majority, 3/4 or more of private domestic adoptions maintain an ongoing relationship with the birth family, and so they're in communication. They have an open relationship that is, beneficial for everyone involved. And families that have that really are grateful for it. They express a lot of satisfaction with it. That's not a negative thing or a scary thing for those that are experiencing it. It's something that they're grateful for.
Awesome. Wow. And can they find that research on your website as well?
Yeah, they can. And even the report that I mentioned, has some of the statistics about the percentage of open adoptions, and the attitudes towards adoption is something that we link to.
Okay, very cool resources. So let's jump to this question. For those families who have made the decision, we're going to adopt. We've put a lot of emphasis on make sure you're doing your homework, make sure you're informing yourself and being knowledgeable. Is there anything outside of that they ought to know when starting the process? Or is starting the process kind of the same regardless of where you live?
Well, I think it's going through that order of thinking through first, what type of adoption, and that's going to be connected in large part to the characteristics of the child that's going to be placed for adoption. And so thinking through those questions towards the very beginning, and then it's important to choose a good service provider who's going to be assisting you. So picking a reputable agency, talking to references and others that are going to ensure that your agency is walking you through what can be a difficult process. And we have a directory on our website. There's lots of ways you could find adoption agencies, and then really do your homework to make sure this is going to be the right fit for you. And then that agency's role should be to walk families through each step of the process. So picking the right agency, after you choose what type of adoption you're going to be pursuing, and then continuing, as I like the way you were putting this earlier in terms of, you're emotionally ready, you're physically, you're financially, you're prepared for this. And that's something that you're continuing an ongoing, development, that you're thinking about this, just like we would for other children joining our families, but perhaps even more so with adoption, because there could be, more that you're taking on in terms of what life's going to look like after the adoption's finalized or after that placement happens. And being sure that your marriage is strong, that you are you're thinking through the impact not just on yourself as the parent or the child that's joining your family, but other children in your household, and really having a strong understanding of what that will be and what resources are available. We often encourage families to be looking and planning on who are we going to be getting help from after the adoption. So lining that up in advance. Not just what doctor am I going to go to, but if I need help for some type of therapeutic service, how does that work with my health insurance plan? What have other families done in these situations? what if my child, if I have a school-aged child, and do I understand how to get an educational accommodation like an IEP or what's called a 504 plan? You know, expecting that things like that are going to come up for your family is going to be wise. And so, doing as much work as you can before the placement is going to make life easier after the placement.
Got you. So I asked the question because I'm very ignorant to the process. I think even the way I posed the question the first time kind of left you in awe because it probably wasn't a great question given the context. But so I wasn't fully aware of how everything works. So you work with an agency. Once you make the determination of the type of adoption you're going to go with, you find an agency and they basically hold your hand.
They should. A good agency will hold your hand through that process. You might end up working with multiple agencies. If, like, I'll give you an example. My family, I live in Virginia. We worked with our primary agency was based in Texas. That agency partnered with a local Virginia licensed agency that came in and did our home study. That came in and met the requirements of the state of Virginia, and they did some training with us, and they're the ones who wrote that home study report. And so we had two agencies that were involved, but that primary agency, the one that I mentioned is based in Texas, they were the ones that would guide us through the process and say, okay, here's your next step, here's what you need to do, and they walked us through it.
Okay. And you also mentioned, which I think this is a really wise thing that I would definitely not have considered, but having help lined up after the adoption is finalized. Would you be working with the same agencies at that point, or are there different types of agencies that deal with, post-adoption, adoptive care?
Another good question. I think your agencies can and should be identifying like resources that can be available, but there'll often be others that are going to be the actual service providers. And so if you're getting mental health counseling, or if you're going for physical therapy or occupational therapy, that's not going to be through your adoption agency. They might have suggestions, but they might not know the best things in your localized area. So that's where having other adoptive families local to you can be really helpful, or being connected through a school social worker or others can be really helpful, who those individuals might be able to say, here's what others have found in your area that work very well, and not assuming that all of our providers are going to be adoption competent. In some areas, pediatricians don't have a lot of experience working with adoptive families, and we might need to be helping educate them on what differences are going to be present for adoptive families, or they might need to be working with colleagues that they have to educate themselves. So some school systems are going to be really thoughtful about different needs that adoptive families will have. Others are going to have far less experience and resources to devote towards that. And so that might look like even more on the parents to come in and say, well, I'm going to try and do more to partner with the school system and partner with teachers so that we can ensure that this classroom is a good place for a child, or that the faculty have the knowledge and resources and skills that are necessary to be inclusive of our families.
Okay. Yeah, that's fantastic. There are two things that I've definitely taken away from what you've shared today. One is you got to have a community around you. You definitely need to have a community of those who have been there and done that to help you through the process. You probably also need to visit adoptioncouncil.org for some resources. That's definitely what I've taken from this. It sounds like your organization has put in a vast amount of work to make this as easy as possible. So definitely going to toot your horn there and say check out adoptioncouncil.org, and also look for people in your community that have adopted or who have been in fostering and who have fostered to adopt, and pick their brains and learn from them. And that seems to be the way to go. Now, I'll ask you one final question. Again, you were the president and CEO of the National Council for Adoption. You yourself, you and your wife have adopted a child. We've talked a lot about doing research. We've talked a lot about making sure you're knowledgeable and you've done your homework. But is there any other special little tip or piece of advice that you'd like to leave with families who are looking to adopt?
You know, I keep going back to being in community, and for families that are people of faith, incorporating your faith into this process, I think, is critical, and talking to your church communities or your faith communities about what support looks like can be critical, and making sure that, this is an important decision. It's a permanent decision. Taking the time to ensure that we do this right and that we have the enough resources is important, because we're wanting to make sure this is the right fit for everyone involved. This isn't about just that child. This is about the whole family, and we want this to be a place of health and thriving for everyone. And that's not going to happen if we try and force something that isn't the right fit. And so giving ourselves permission to say now's not the right time, or we don't have what it takes for this particular child in advance, or this particular age, or this particular medical special need, is something that we should be okay with, where we're comfortable saying we can only handle so much, and we're gonna ensure that that when a child then does come into our family, that we are at a place where we can be, providing for that child's needs, and not in a place where we're constantly feeling overwhelmed or unable to. Now, do unexpected things come up? Of course they do, just like every child that's ever joined our families. But in advance, being really thoughtful and thinking through that to set ourselves up for success.
Gotcha. All right. Well, there's definitely power in community. That's why it's a part of my mission with Fathering Our Future, because I think that's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it with a community of dads. Ryan, you've been fantastic. I know that my listeners are smarter than me, so they've definitely learned a little bit, because I've learned a lot. And I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be with me and to share your knowledge and insight on adoption. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for helping spread the message, and I've enjoyed our time together.
Awesome. Happy to do it, and definitely hope that it makes an impact. What an incredibly insightful and informative interview. Ryan Hanlon, the president and CEO of the National Council for Adoption. If you had questions about adoption, I'm confident he likely answered those questions. And even if he didn't answer all of your questions, he gave you a resource that will help you. That is adoptioncouncil.org. Check out the website. Surveys, studies, testimonials, the resources that you need to answer your questions about adoption, you can find at adoptioncouncil.org. Now you know that adoption isn't as expensive as you might have thought it was. And you know that you can tap into those around you. You can tap into the community of those who have adopted children to learn a thing or two. And you can also check out the website, adoptioncouncil.org, to get the information that you need. You can do this if you want to do it, if you want to adopt, if you want to change a kid's life, you can do it, and now there's nothing stopping you. This is Fathering Our Future, the podcast for dads. I'm Anthony Vandegrift. Thank you for being with me, and I hope you will join me next time. Hey, thanks for watching today's episode. I hope it has blessed you and challenged you to strive to be a better dad every day. And if you'd like more great content like this, just subscribe to the channel. Also, if you think dads are valuable and essential to the family, consider supporting this effort. Just go to fatheringourfuture.com and click support. Every contribution helps, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you for being a part of Fathering Our Future.